Hey there, and welcome to the Stillness Broadcast. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before you settle in too deeply, I'd really appreciate it if you could take just a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you might think. And here's something I always love to see. Drop a comment below telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. It's incredible to think about all of us scattered across the world, sharing these stories in our own little pockets of darkness. Now get yourself comfortable. Maybe adjust your pillow. Pull that blanket a little closer. Let the world outside fade away. Tonight, I have 6 stories that I think you're really going to find unsettling in all the right ways. So let's begin. Story 1. The inheritance came with conditions I didn't understand until it was too late. My Uncle Morris had been the kind of man who collected peculiar things, not valuable antiques or rare books, but objects that seemed to accumulate significance through pure stubbornness. When he died at 73, alone in his cluttered Philadelphia row house, I was surprised to learn I'd been named sole beneficiary of his estate. We'd never been close. I remembered him as a distant figure at family gatherings, always observing from corners, always writing in those endless notebooks he carried. The lawyer, a tired woman named Patricia Venn, met me at the house on a February afternoon, when the sky pressed down like wet concrete. She handed me a key that felt heavier than it should have been, and a sealed envelope with my name written in my uncle's spidery handwriting. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper with 3 rules written in careful block letters. 1. You must spend at least 1 hour in the house every day for 30 consecutive days. 2. You must never remove anything from the blue room. 3. You must read every notebook in order, cover to cover, without skipping pages. Failure to follow these rules will result in the forfeiture of the inheritance, which includes the house valued at $400,000 and liquid assets totaling $260,000. It seemed eccentric but manageable. I was between jobs, between relationships, between versions of myself that had failed in ways I was still cataloging. A month of daily visits to a dead man's house felt like a small price to pay for financial security. The house smelled of old paper and something else, something organic that made me think of museums and preserved things. Every surface was covered. Stacks of newspapers dating back decades, mason jars filled with buttons and screws and things I couldn't identify, boxes labeled in my uncle's precise handwriting with cryptic descriptions like Afternoon Sounds, July 1987, or Dreams Recurring Set B. I found the notebooks in the study, arranged on custom-built shelves that covered 3 walls, floor to ceiling. There were hundreds of them, identical black composition books numbered in gold paint on their spines. I pulled down number 1, dated March 1971, and opened it to the first page. The entry was mundane. My uncle describing his morning routine, the weather, a conversation with a neighbor about garbage collection schedules. But there was something in the level of detail that felt wrong. He'd noted the exact time he'd woken up, 6:47 a.m., the number of steps from his bedroom to the bathroom, 32, the temperature of the water when he washed his face, 67 degrees Fahrenheit. Every moment of his day had been documented with the same obsessive precision. I read for an hour that first day, learning nothing except that my uncle had been even stranger than I'd imagined. When I left, I made sure to lock the door carefully, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside was watching me go. The blue room was on the 2nd floor, its door painted the color of a drowned sky. I'd noticed it during my initial walk-through, but hadn't tried to open it. Rule 2 had been explicit. Now, standing in the hallway on my 3rd visit, I found myself staring at that door with an intensity that made my eyes water. There was no lock, just a simple brass knob worn smooth by decades of use. I could open it. I should open it, just to understand what I was protecting. The thought came with surprising force, like someone had whispered it directly into my ear. I forced myself back downstairs to the study and pulled down notebook 17. My uncle's entries had become stranger. He'd started documenting not just his own activities, but the activities of his neighbors. Mrs. Caldwell leaves her house at 8:15 every Tuesday and Thursday. She walks to the bus stop on Broad Street, always staying on the shaded side of the street. She carries a green purse on Tuesdays and a black one on Thursdays. When it rains, she doesn't go out at all. I've verified this pattern for 6 months without exception. The detail was unsettling, but what bothered me more was the tone. My uncle wasn't just observing. He was testing, confirming patterns, looking for deviations. The notebooks became populated with dozens of people, each one documented with the same exhaustive attention. Their routines, their habits, their small deviations and returns to pattern, and threaded through it all was a growing sense of purpose, though what that purpose might be remained frustratingly unclear. By the end of the second week, I'd made it through 47 notebooks and had developed my own routine. I'd arrive at 3 in the afternoon, make coffee in my uncle's ancient percolator, settle into the leather armchair in the study, and read until the light failed. The house had stopped feeling threatening and started feeling almost comfortable, which should have worried me more than it did. Notebook 53 contained the first mention of the Blue Room. "I've completed the preparations," my uncle had written. "The room is ready. Everything I've learned, everything I've documented, everything I've understood about the patterns, it all leads here. The room will preserve it. The room will keep it safe. The room will ensure the work continues." I sat with that entry for a long time, the afternoon light turning syrupy and golden around me. What work? What patterns? I'd been reading for 2 weeks and still had no idea what my uncle had been trying to accomplish with his decades of meticulous observation. That night, I dreamed about the Blue Room. In the dream, I opened the door and found myself looking into a space that was simultaneously vast and impossibly small. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with photographs, thousands of them, all showing the same thing. People going about their daily routines, captured in moments of perfect predictability. And in the center of the room, sitting in a chair identical to the one in my uncle's study, was my uncle himself. He looked up at me with an expression of profound satisfaction. "You're learning," he said. "You're beginning to see the patterns." I woke with my heart hammering and my mouth dry. The dream had felt less like imagination and more like memory, though I'd never entered the Blue Room. I'd never seen those photographs. I'd never heard my uncle speak with that particular inflection of triumph. I arrived at the house earlier than usual the next day. The Blue Room's door seemed to glow in the dim hallway light, pulsing almost, calling to me with a frequency I felt in my teeth. I stood there for what might have been minutes or hours, my hand reaching toward the knob before I snatched it back. Rule 2 had been explicit. Never remove anything from the Blue Room. But it hadn't said I couldn't enter. It hadn't said I couldn't look. The distinction felt important, though some part of me recognized it as rationalization. I was looking for permission to do what I'd wanted to do since the first day, to understand what my uncle had been protecting, what he'd thought was important enough to make conditions in his will. My hand touched the knob. It was cold, much colder than it should have been given the house's temperature. I turned it slowly, feeling the mechanism click open with surprising ease. The door swung inward on well-oiled hinges, revealing a room that was nothing like what I'd dreamed, and everything like what I'd feared. The space was small, maybe 10 feet square, with no windows and walls painted that same drowned sky blue. But it wasn't empty. The floor was covered in notebooks, hundreds of them, stacked in precise towers that reached nearly to the ceiling. Between the towers, narrow paths had been left clear, creating a maze that led to the room's center. And there, sitting on a small table, was a single photograph in a silver frame. I knew I shouldn't enter. Knew I was violating the spirit, if not the letter of Rule 2. But my feet carried me forward anyway, navigating the maze of notebooks with careful steps. The photograph showed a man standing on a street corner. He was middle-aged, unremarkable, wearing a gray suit and carrying a briefcase. But something about the image made my skin prickle. It had been taken from an odd angle, as if the photographer had been hiding, and the man's expression was one of complete unawareness. He had no idea he was being watched. I picked up the frame, meaning only to examine it more closely, and felt the world lurch sideways. The photograph changed in my hands. The man in the gray suit was still there, still unaware. But now I could see text overlaying the image. Dates, times, locations, all documented in my uncle's precise handwriting. This was subject 1. This was the beginning of whatever my uncle had been doing for the past 50 years. And as I held the photograph, I understood with sudden, terrible clarity that the pattern my uncle had been tracking wasn't random observation. It was something else. Something that required this room, these notebooks, this careful preservation. The notebooks in the towers around me weren't blank. They were filled with my uncle's handwriting, but the writing was different from what I'd been reading in the study. These entries were predictive. February 3rd, Subject 17 will leave his apartment at 7:45 a.m. He will stop at the corner store for coffee, black, 2 sugars. He will arrive at work at 8:30 o.m. He will eat lunch at his desk. He will leave work at 5:15 p.m. He will stop at the pharmacy on his way home. He will be in bed by 11 p.m. And beneath that, in red ink, verified, accuracy 100%. My uncle had been predicting people's behavior with perfect accuracy. Not guessing, not estimating, but knowing with absolute certainty what they would do and when they would do it. The implications made my mind feel like it was folding in on itself. I set the photograph down carefully and backed out of the room, my hands shaking. I pulled the door closed and stood in the hallway, trying to steady my breathing. I'd violated Rule 2, or at least come very close to it. But more than that, I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to see. Something that suggested my uncle hadn't been eccentric. He'd been something else entirely. The notebooks in the study took on new meaning after that. I read them with different eyes, looking for the moment when observation had transformed into prediction. I found it in Notebook 93, dated April 1984. I've discovered something extraordinary, my uncle had written. The patterns aren't random. They're deterministic. Every person moves through their life following invisible tracks, making choices that feel free but are actually inevitable. If you watch long enough, if you document thoroughly enough, if you understand the underlying architecture, you can see what's coming. You can know with certainty what a person will do before they do it. This changes everything. The entries after that became increasingly excited, increasingly obsessive. My uncle had started with simple predictions, testing his theory on the neighbors he'd been observing for years. Mrs. Caldwell's Tuesday and Thursday bus schedule, Mr. Prentice's weekend grocery shopping, the mailman's deviation from his route when it rained, all of it documented, predicted, verified. And as his accuracy improved, he'd expanded his scope. More subjects, more predictions, more verification. The Blue Room had become necessary around 1990, according to Notebook 206. I need a place to preserve the work, he'd written. The predictions are too valuable to risk. If something happens to me, someone needs to continue. Someone needs to verify that the patterns hold, that the architecture remains stable. I was approaching the end of the 30 days when I found the notebook marked Final Instructions. It had been filed out of sequence, tucked into a gap on the shelf where I'd almost missed it. The first page contained a single paragraph in my uncle's handwriting. If you're reading this, you've made it to day 27 or beyond. You've been following the rules, reading the notebooks, learning the patterns. You're ready for the final truth. The Blue Room contains predictions for every person in a 3-mile radius of this house, updated continuously until my death. But it also contains one more prediction, a prediction about you, about what you'll do when you inherit this house, about whether you'll continue the work or abandon it. I've known since you were 16 years old what choice you'll make. The photograph on the table shows you, and the notebooks in the towers document every day of your life from this moment forward. I've seen your future, and I need you to verify that I was right. My hands went numb. I dropped the notebook, and it hit the floor with a sound like a gunshot. The photograph in the Blue Room hadn't shown a middle-aged man in a gray suit. It had shown me, standing in that room, holding that frame, reading those predictions about my own life. My uncle had been predicting me, had been documenting my inevitable choices, my determined path, my illusory free will. And he'd arranged his inheritance, his rules, his entire estate to ensure I discover it exactly when I was supposed to. On day 27, with 3 days left to complete the requirement, I could leave, could walk out of the house right now and never return, could forfeit the inheritance and the knowledge it contained. But my uncle had predicted I wouldn't do that, had known with certainty that I'd stay, that I'd complete the 30 days, that I'd enter the Blue Room again and read the notebooks that documented my future. I was furious and terrified in equal measure. The idea that my life was predetermined, that every choice I thought I was making freely was actually just playing out along tracks I couldn't see, was intolerable. But the alternative, not knowing what the notebooks predicted, not understanding what my uncle had seen in my future, was somehow worse. I spent the next 2 days in a haze, barely sleeping, barely eating. I read the remaining notebooks in the study mechanically, but none of them mattered anymore. The only notebooks that mattered were the ones in the Blue Room, the ones with my name on them, the ones that held my future in my uncle's precise handwriting. On day 30, I entered the Blue Room again. This time, I didn't hesitate, didn't rationalize. I walked straight to the nearest tower and pulled down the notebook on top. It was labeled Subject 473, Nephew, Year 1. I opened it to the first page and began to read. The predictions were mundane at first. The coffee I'd drink tomorrow morning, the job application I'd submit next week, the person I'd meet at a bookstore in 3 months, all of it written in past tense, as if it had already happened, as if my uncle had watched me live a life I hadn't lived yet. But as I read deeper into the notebook, as I progressed through the months and years my uncle had predicted, the entries became more disturbing. Subject will experience significant loss on date specified. One entry read, will make characteristic response. will seek isolation, pattern consistent with established behavior. Another, subject will be offered opportunity for major life change, will decline due to fear of deviation, pattern holds. And another, subject will enter blue room on day 30, exactly as predicted, will read these words, will understand that every choice leading to this moment was determined, will face the central question, does knowing the pattern change the pattern, or does the pattern account even for the knowledge of itself? I looked up from the notebook and saw that I was crying. Not from sadness, but from a rage so pure it felt like it might consume me from the inside. My uncle had taken everything, every moment of spontaneity, every instance of free will, every choice I'd thought was mine, and reduced it to a data point in his deterministic universe. And he'd been so certain of his patterns that he'd built this entire inheritance around forcing me to confront it. But there was one thing I could do that might not be predicted. One choice that might prove the patterns weren't absolute. I could remove something from the blue room. Rule 2 had been explicit. Never remove anything. But maybe that rule wasn't just about protecting my uncle's work. Maybe it was about protecting me from the knowledge that even my rebellion was predetermined. From the proof that I would or wouldn't break the rule exactly as my uncle had foreseen. I reached for the photograph on the table, the one showing me in this moment, and hesitated. My hand hovered over the frame, shaking with indecision. If I took it, I'd be breaking Rule 2, forfeiting the inheritance, proving I could deviate from the pattern. But if my uncle had predicted I'd take it, then taking it would just be following the pattern in a different way. And if he'd predicted I wouldn't take it, then leaving it would be following the pattern. There was no way to win, no way to prove my choices were my own, unless I did something truly random, something no amount of observation could predict. I pulled out my phone, opened a coin flip app, and set 2 outcomes. Heads, I take the photograph and leave forever. Tails, I stay in the house and continue my uncle's work. I hit the button and watched the digital coin spin. It landed on tails. I laughed, a sound that was more sob than humor. Even my attempt at randomness had been determined. My uncle had probably predicted I'd use a coin flip, had probably documented the exact moment I'd think of it, the exact app I'd choose, the exact outcome I'd get. I picked up the photograph after all and turned it over. On the back, in my uncle's handwriting, was a single sentence. The coin will land on tails. You'll take the photograph anyway. Pattern holds. I sank to my knees in the blue room, surrounded by towers of notebooks documenting lives that weren't really lived so much as inevitably experienced. And I understood, finally, what my uncle had been trying to teach me. The patterns were real. Free will was an illusion. Every choice was determined by a lifetime of prior choices, themselves determined by genetics and environment and chance events that felt random, but were just as predictable if you knew enough variables. I could fight it, could rage against the deterministic universe my uncle had revealed, could spend the rest of my life trying to prove the patterns wrong. But that too was probably predicted in one of these notebooks. That too was just part of my particular pattern. The inheritance was mine. The house, the money, the blue room full of predictions. And with it came a responsibility I hadn't understood until this moment. My uncle had watched patterns his entire life, but he'd never tried to change them, had never intervened, had maintained a purely observational stance. But what if observation wasn't enough? What if understanding the patterns meant you had the ability, maybe even the obligation, to warn people when they were heading toward catastrophic choices? I opened subject 473, nephew, year 2, and found entries that made my blood run cold. Major health crisis, date specified. Will ignore warning signs. Will avoid medical intervention due to fear of doctors. Outcome, preventable death. I could change this if the prediction was accurate. If I really was heading toward a preventable death, then knowing about it gave me the chance to deviate, to prove the pattern wrong, to save my own life. Unless my uncle had predicted this too. Unless the notebook went on to document my attempts to change my fate and their inevitable failure. I forced myself to keep reading. The entry continued. Subject will read this prediction, will believe intervention is possible, will schedule medical appointment, will discover condition in early stages, will survive. Pattern accounts for knowledge of pattern. Survival was always determined. My uncle had known I'd know, had known I'd try to change things, had known I'd succeed, because succeeding was part of the pattern. The relief I felt was overwhelmed by a deeper horror. I couldn't escape the pattern, even by trying to escape the pattern. Every deviation I made was just another track the pattern had always included. I spent the rest of that day in the blue room, reading through my predicted life. Some entries filled me with dread, others with cautious hope. All of them felt true in a way I couldn't rationally explain but couldn't deny. When I finally left, I took nothing with me except the knowledge that my uncle had been right. About everything. The patterns were real. The predictions were accurate. And I would continue his work because that's what the pattern had always said I'd do. 6 months later, I'm still living in the house, still reading the notebooks, still learning the patterns. I've started making my own predictions, testing them against reality, verifying their accuracy. I've converted the 3rd floor bedroom into my own workspace, filling it with new notebooks documenting new subjects. And late at night, when the house is quiet and the weight of determinism feels like it might crush me, I go to the blue room and read the later volumes of my uncle's predictions about my life. The volumes that document the years I haven't lived yet, the choices I haven't made yet, the person I'll inevitably become. There's a notebook labeled Final Volume that I haven't opened. It's on the highest tower, barely reachable even with the stepladder. My uncle placed it there deliberately, I'm sure. Saved the end of my story for when I'd be ready to know it. I'm not ready yet. Maybe I never will be. But I know that one day, maybe next week, maybe next year, maybe in a decade, I'll climb that tower and read the final predictions. And I'll discover whether my uncle saw me continuing his work forever, or whether he predicted I'd eventually find a way to break free. Though if he predicted my freedom, doesn't that mean freedom was just another determined outcome? Doesn't that mean the pattern holds even in its own dissolution? These are the questions that keep me up at night. These are the thoughts that circle my mind like moths around a flame. And somewhere in the blue room, in notebooks I haven't read yet, my uncle has probably predicted these exact questions, has probably documented the exact moment I'd think them, has probably verified that the pattern accounts even for my doubt. I continue the work because there's nothing else to do. Because the pattern says I will. Because every alternative was already determined not to happen. And sometimes standing in the blue room surrounded by towers of inevitable futures, I think I understand why my uncle seems so content in his observations. If everything is determined, then nothing is your fault. Not your failures, not your cruelties, not your abandonments. You're just following the pattern laid down by forces beyond your control. It's almost comforting, almost peaceful, almost like freedom if you don't think about it too hard. The photograph still sits on the table, showing me in this moment reading these words. And I know that tomorrow I'll add my own entry to subject 473, nephew, year 1. I'll document that I read my uncle's predictions, that I understood the pattern, that I chose, if choice is even the right word, to continue. And someday, maybe someone will inherit this house from me, will find themselves bound by rules they don't understand, will discover the blue room and the patterns and the terrible comfort of determined existence. And they'll read my notebooks and my predictions, and they'll understand, as I understand now, that they never had a choice at all. The pattern was always going to bring them here. The pattern accounts for everything. The pattern holds. Story 2. The support group met in the basement of St. Catherine's Episcopal Church every Thursday evening at 7. 12 folding chairs arranged in a circle, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of old coffee and older grief hanging in the air like smoke. I'd been coming for 6 weeks, ever since the accident left me with a scar that ran from my left temple to my jawline, and a persistent sense that I'd lost something more important than just my face's symmetry. The group was called Surviving Ourselves, which I'd initially thought was needlessly dramatic. But after listening to the others share their stories of surgeries and recoveries, and the strange alienation of looking in the mirror and seeing a stranger, I'd begun to understand the name's accuracy. We were all trying to survive the people we'd become after our bodies betrayed us. There were 8 regular members. Patricia, who'd lost both legs in a train derailment. Marcus, whose face had been reconstructed after an industrial accident left him nearly unrecognizable. Diana, who'd survived cancer but not the mastectomy. Others came and went, but the core group remained stable. We knew each other's stories by heart, could predict each other's bad days, understood without words when someone needed silence instead of sympathy. And then there was Iris. She'd appeared on my 7th week, arriving 10 minutes late, and taking the only empty chair without apology or explanation. She was perhaps 60, with silver hair cut brutally short, and eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. Her left arm was gone from just below the shoulder, the sleeve of her cardigan pinned neatly against her side, but it was her expression that caught my attention. Not sadness or anger or any of the familiar stages of grief. Just a kind of attentive curiosity, as if she were watching a play whose ending she already knew. When it was her turn to share, she introduced herself simply. I'm Iris Marchmont. I lost my arm 43 years ago. I'm here because I was told it might help. Our facilitator, a gentleman named Robert who'd lost his hearing in a construction accident, encouraged her to share more, to tell us about the circumstances of her loss. Iris shook her head. The circumstances don't matter. The loss is the same regardless of cause. What matters is what came after. She paused, those strange eyes moving around the circle. What matters is what we become in the absence. The group was quiet. We'd heard variations on this theme before, but something in Iris's delivery made the words feel heavier than usual. More like a warning than wisdom. Over the following weeks, I found myself watching Iris more than was probably appropriate. She spoke rarely during the meetings, usually offering only brief comments that somehow cut to the heart of whatever the group was discussing. But after the meetings, while the rest of us lingered for coffee and small talk, she'd disappear immediately. Not rushing exactly, but moving with clear purpose toward some destination she never explained. One evening, driven by curiosity I couldn't fully justify, I followed her. She walked 3 blocks east to a neighborhood I didn't recognize. then entered an old brick building that might once have been a warehouse. I waited across the street, feeling foolish and intrusive, until a light came on in a second-floor window. For just a moment, I saw Iris's silhouette, and beside her, clear and distinct, was the shadow of a second person. Except Iris had entered the building alone. I'd watched her go in. I'd seen no one else on the street. The next Thursday, I arrived early to the meeting and positioned myself next to where Iris usually sat. When she arrived, I tried to make conversation, asked about her week, her work, anything to establish some connection beyond our shared attendance at support group therapy. She answered politely but minimally, revealing nothing. It wasn't until the meeting ended and I pretended to need help folding chairs that I managed to engineer a moment alone with her. "The building on Halsted Street," I said before I could lose my nerve. "I saw you go in last week." I wasn't trying to intrude, Iris looked at me with those penetrating eyes, and I felt suddenly exposed. "You followed me." It wasn't a question. I was curious, I admitted. "You seem different from the rest of us. Like you've figured something out that we haven't." A slight smile touched her lips. "Would you like to know what I've figured out?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Come with me after the next meeting," she said. "I'll show you. But understand that once you see, you can't unsee. Some knowledge changes you irrevocably." I should have been warned off by that statement, should have recognized it for what it was. But I was desperate for meaning, desperate for purpose, desperate for anything that might transform my loss into something other than random suffering. The following Thursday felt interminable. I barely listened to the others sharing, couldn't focus on Robert's gentle facilitation. All I could think about was what Iris might show me in that building on Halsted Street. When the meeting finally ended, she caught my eye and gave a small nod. I followed her out into the October evening. We walked in silence, Iris setting a pace that was brisk but not uncomfortable. The building looked even more forbidding up close, its brick facade water-stained and crumbling in places. Iris produced a key from her pocket and opened the heavy metal door. "The landlord is remarkably uninterested in who comes and goes," she said, leading me up a narrow staircase. "As long as the rent is paid, he asks no questions." The second-floor apartment was larger than I'd expected, a single open space with high ceilings and tall windows that looked out over the street. The furnishings were minimal: a table, a few chairs, a kitchenette in one corner. But what dominated the space were the mirrors. Dozens of them, hundreds maybe, covering every wall in overlapping arrangements. Some were large, ornate things that looked like they belonged in a Victorian mansion. Others were small hand mirrors or compact pieces that reflected only fragments. And in the gaps between mirrors, pinned directly to the walls, were photographs. "I don't understand," I said, my voice sounding small in the vast space. "You will," Iris replied. She walked to the nearest wall and gestured at a photograph. "This is Marcus from our group. This is how he looked before his accident." I stepped closer. The photograph showed a man who was recognizable as Marcus only by his eyes. Everything else about his face was different. Softer, more conventionally handsome. "And this," Iris continued, moving to another photograph, "is Patricia before the derailment." The woman in the image had both legs. She was standing on a beach, smiling at the camera with uncomplicated joy. Iris moved around the room, identifying photograph after photograph. Every member of our support group was represented, shown in their before state, whole and undamaged. "How did you get these?" I asked. though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "I didn't get them," Iris said. "They found me, or rather, they found this place. The building has a peculiar property. It accumulates losses. Every person who's suffered a significant physical trauma, every amputation and scar and irreversible change, the loss leaves a kind of impression, an echo. This building collects those echoes." I laughed nervously. "That's not possible, isn't it? You've felt it yourself, haven't you? The sense that something's missing beyond just the physical change. The feeling that the person you were before is still somewhere, displaced but not quite gone. I had felt that, had felt it acutely in the weeks after my accident. The conviction that the old version of myself, the one with an unmarked face and easy confidence, was nearby but just out of reach. The mirrors help," Iris continued. "They multiply the echoes, make them stronger, more visible. Watch." She walked to the center of the room and stood among the mirrors. In their reflections, I saw not just Iris, but dozens of versions of Iris, each one slightly different. And in one particular mirror, an ornate oval thing with a tarnished silver frame, I saw Iris with 2 arms. The reflection was perfect. No missing limb, no pinned sleeve. Just a whole person standing where a damaged one should be. "That's impossible," I whispered, though I was staring directly at the evidence. "That's what I thought for the first year," Iris said. "Then I realized it wasn't impossible. It was just uncommon. Most people never find the place where their lost selves accumulate. Never discover that the person they were before still exists in a kind of parallel state. But those of us who do find it, we have a choice to make." "What choice?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Whether to stay as we are, or to retrieve what we've lost. Iris turned to face me fully. "The mirrors are doorways. If you stand in the right place, look at the right angle, you can reach through and bring back the missing piece. But there's a cost. There's always a cost." My mouth was dry. "What kind of cost?" "The person you've become since the loss. The growth. The adaptation. The hard-won wisdom. All of it goes into the mirror. In exchange for what you take out, you get back your arm, your legs, your unmarked face. But you lose everything you've learned from losing it." I looked around the room at all those photographs, all those before images of damaged people. "The others in the group, do they know about this place?" Iris shook her head. "Only a few. The ones I thought were ready to make the choice. Some of them took what the mirrors offered. Some didn't. But they all had to decide." I walked to the nearest mirror, a large rectangular piece that showed me in profile. My scar was clearly visible, a livid line that destroyed any pretense of symmetry. I'd grown to hate that scar, had avoided mirrors for weeks after the accident, but lately I'd begun to think of it as a kind of map, evidence of a journey I hadn't chosen but had survived nonetheless. "I want to see," I said. "Want to see what?" "What I'd be retrieving. The version of myself that still has an unmarked face." Iris guided me to a specific position, adjusting my angle by millimeters until she was satisfied. "Look in the oval mirror on the far wall," she instructed. "The one with the silver frame. Look and keep looking. Don't blink." I followed her instruction. At first, I saw only my regular reflection, scar and all. But as my eyes adjusted, as I maintained my focus, something shifted. The reflection began to clear, like fog burning off glass. And slowly, gradually, I saw myself as I had been before the accident. The change was subtle. Just the absence of the scar, really. But it transformed everything. My confidence, my ease, My entire relationship with the world was written on that unmarked face. "You can reach through," Iris said softly. "Just extend your hand and pull. It's easier than you think." I raised my hand, watching my scarred reflection do the same. But in the oval mirror, the unscarred version raised its hand too. And for a moment, just a moment, I felt that I could bridge the gap, could touch that earlier self and reclaim it. "What did you choose?" I asked Iris, lowering my hand. "Did you take back your arm?" "No," she said simply. "I chose to keep what I'd learned, to remain as I am. But it was the hardest decision I've ever made, and I've regretted it every day since. Not because I made the wrong choice, but because any choice in this situation is a kind of loss." I stood there for a long time, watching both versions of myself. The scarred present and the unmarked past. The person I was and the person I might have been. And I realized that Iris was right. Any choice would be a loss. If I took back my unmarked face, I'd lose the strength I'd developed in learning to live with the scar. But if I stayed as I was, I'd lose the ease and confidence that had defined my earlier self. There was no winning, only choosing which loss I could best survive. "I need to think about this," I said finally. Iris nodded. "Take your time. The mirrors will be here. The echoes don't fade. But understand that the longer you wait, the harder the choice becomes. Every day you live with your loss, you become more of the person shaped by that loss. Eventually, the gap between who you are and who you were becomes too wide to bridge. You'll still see your unmarked self in the mirror, but you won't be able to reach it anymore." I left the building in a daze, my mind churning with possibilities. The support group suddenly made sense in a new way. We were all people standing at the same crossroads, whether we knew it or not. All trying to decide if we wanted to retrieve what we'd lost or become something new in the absence. Over the following weeks, I returned to the building several times, stood among the mirrors, watched my unscarred reflection, felt the pull of that easier existence. But I never reached through, never made the exchange. Because the more I thought about it, the more I realized that my scar wasn't just a loss. It was a story. Evidence that I'd survived something terrible. And stories, even painful ones, are how we make sense of existence. The last time I saw Iris was at a Thursday meeting 3 months after she'd shown me the building. She looked different somehow, more solid, more present. I caught her eye across the circle, and she smiled. After the meeting, I asked if she'd changed her mind, if she'd gone back through the mirror and retrieved her missing arm. She rolled up her sleeve in response. The arm was there, whole and functional, but wrong somehow. The skin was too smooth, the proportions slightly off. It looked like an arm, as imagined by someone who'd only ever seen arms in photographs. "I couldn't resist," she said quietly. 43 years was too long. I wanted to know what it felt like to be whole again. "And?" I asked. "How does it feel?" She looked down at the reclaimed arm, flexing the fingers with visible effort. "It feels like wearing someone else's clothes. Like pretending to be a person I'm not anymore. I gave up everything I'd learned to get it back. And now I can't remember why I thought it would be worth the cost." She met my eyes. "Don't make my mistake. Don't trade wisdom for wholeness. The price is too high." I never went back to the building on Halsted Street, never stood among those mirrors again, never reached through to retrieve the unmarked version of myself. The scar remains, a livid line that maps my journey from before to after, and I've learned to wear it not with pride exactly, but with acceptance. It's part of my story now, part of who I've become. Some losses can be reclaimed. Some mirrors offer doorways to earlier versions of ourselves. But the person who walks through those doorways comes back changed in ways that can't be predicted or controlled. And sometimes the bravest choice is to stay broken, to build a new self from the fragments, rather than trying to glue the old self back together. I still go to the support group every Thursday. Still sit in that circle of folding chairs and listen to others process their losses. But now I listen with the knowledge that healing isn't about becoming who we were before. It's about learning to inhabit who we are now. Scars and all. Story 3. The last train out of Edinburgh ran at 11:45, which meant Colin had exactly 12 minutes to make it across the city from the pub where his business meeting had run egregiously long. He sprinted through streets still slick with evening rain, his briefcase banging against his leg, his breath coming in ragged gasps that tasted of whiskey and poor decisions. The platform was empty when he arrived, which meant he'd either made it with minutes to spare or missed the train entirely. The departure board flickered uncertainly, showing times that seemed to change whenever he blinked. A figure stood at the far end of the platform, a woman in a long coat. Her face turned toward the dark tunnel where the train would emerge. Colin checked his watch. 11:43. 2 minutes. Did I make it? He called to the woman. Is the train still coming? She turned slowly, and even from 30 feet away, Colin could see that something about her was wrong. Not threatening exactly, but displaced. Like she was standing slightly out of phase with the rest of the world. The train always comes, she said. Her voice carried clearly despite the distance. The question is whether you should board it. Before Colin could ask what she meant, lights appeared in the tunnel. The train emerged with a sound that was more whisper than roar, gliding into the station with impossible smoothness. It was older than the standard Edinburgh line carriages, its exterior painted in a deep burgundy that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. The doors opened with a pneumatic sigh. The woman stepped aboard without looking back. Colin hesitated for just a moment, then followed. He had to get home, had to be in London by morning for a meeting he couldn't miss. Whatever strangeness he was sensing could be attributed to exhaustion and too much scotch. The interior of the train was nothing like what he expected. Instead of the modern seating and harsh fluorescent lighting of standard carriages, he found himself in something that resembled a Victorian drawing room. Plush velvet seats, dark wood paneling, gas lamps that flickered with real flame, and passengers, at least a dozen of them, all sitting in attitudes of perfect stillness. None of them acknowledged his entrance. None of them moved at all, as far as he could tell. They simply sat, staring at nothing, their faces bearing expressions of infinite patience. Colin chose a seat near the middle of the carriage, as far as possible from the frozen passengers. The woman who'd been on the platform sat across the aisle, her coat pooling around her feet like dark water. This isn't the standard Edinburgh to London line, Colin said, aiming for confidence but achieving only uncertainty. No, the woman agreed. It's not. Then where does it go? Everywhere and nowhere. It stops at all the stations that exist between places. The liminal spaces. The junctions where possibilities split. Colin laughed nervously. I'm sorry. I must be more tired than I thought. I'm hearing you say impossible things. Impossible from whose perspective? The woman turned to look at him fully for the first time. Her eyes were ordinary enough, brown and slightly tired, but there was something behind them, some vast awareness that made Colin feel like he was being observed by something much larger than a single person. What's your name? he asked, desperate for some anchor of normalcy. "I've had many names. You can call me Alice if it helps." The train began to move, accelerating with unnatural speed. Colin looked out the window and saw the tunnel walls blurring past. But between the blur, he could see things. Glimpses of places that couldn't exist between Edinburgh and London. Desert landscapes under impossible moons. Cities built vertically that reached into cloud-covered skies. Forests where the trees grew downward from the sky. "What is this?" Colin whispered. "What's happening?" "You boarded a train between moments," Alice said. "Between the Edinburgh you know and the London you're trying to reach. Most people make this journey without noticing it. They board, they drowse, they arrive. But occasionally someone perceives what's actually happening. Someone sees the between spaces. When that happens, choices must be made." One of the frozen passengers moved. It was subtle, just a shift of the head. But in the context of their previous absolute stillness, it was shocking. The passenger, an elderly man in a suit that looked decades out of date, turned to look directly at Colin. "He's new," the man said. His voice rust with disuse. "Been a while since we had a new one." Other passengers began to move, their frozen state breaking like ice in spring thaw. They all turned to look at Colin with varying expressions of interest, pity, and something that might have been hunger. "Welcome to the train," a woman in a flapper dress said, smiling with too many teeth. "Once you see it for what it is, you can't unsee it. Every train becomes this train. Every journey passes through the between spaces. And eventually," she gestured around the carriage, "eventually you stop trying to reach your destination and just ride." Colin stood abruptly. "I'm getting off at the next stop." "There is no next stop," Alice said gently. "Not in the way you understand stops. We're between stations, between moments. The only way forward is through." Colin moved toward the carriage door, but found it wouldn't open. Beyond the window, the impossible landscapes continued to blur past. He was trapped on a train that shouldn't exist, traveling through spaces that couldn't be real, surrounded by passengers who'd given up trying to reach their destinations. "How long?" he asked, his voice cracking. "How long have they been riding?" "Some for years, some for decades. Time works differently here. A journey that should take hours can last lifetimes, or end in moments." Alice stood and approached him. "But there is a way off, if you're willing to pay the price." "What price?" Colin asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "The train feeds on potential, on the futures that might have been but weren't. Every choice you've made, every path you didn't take, every version of yourself that could have existed but doesn't. The train collects those possibilities, and if you're willing to give up one of your might-have-beens, it will let you off." Colin thought of his meeting in London, the promotion that hinged on his attendance, the future he'd been building toward for 5 years. "And if I refuse? Then you ride, like the rest of us, forever between moments, watching the world blur past, unable to reach any destination because you're stuck in the space between." The other passengers had returned to their frozen states, perhaps having expended all their available energy on that brief interaction. Only Alice remained mobile, waiting patiently for Colin's decision. "Show me," Colin said finally. "Show me what I'd be giving up." Alice produced something from her coat pocket. It looked like a photograph, but it moved, the image shifting and changing like a living thing. Colin saw himself in the photograph, but older, successful, standing in an office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking London. He saw the life that would unfold if he made his meeting tomorrow. The promotion, the marriage, the children, the slow accumulation of respectability and wealth. It was the future he'd been working toward. The reason he'd taken this train in the first place. "That's what I'll lose?" he asked. Alice nodded. "That particular future, yes. But others will remain possible. Different paths, different choices. The train only takes one might have been. You'll still have a life. Just not this specific one." Colin looked at the frozen passengers, saw their faces, each one bearing the expression of someone who'd refused to pay, who'd chosen to keep all their possibilities rather than sacrifice one, and in doing so, had lost them all. "I'll pay," he said. The relief in Alice's expression was heartbreaking. "You're sure? Once given, it can't be retrieved." "I'm sure." The photograph in Alice's hand caught fire, burning with a flame that produced no heat. Colin watched his potential future reduced to ash, and as it burned, he felt something shift inside himself, a lightness, as if a weight he'd been carrying without knowing it had suddenly lifted. The train began to slow. Through the window, Colin could see a station materializing. It looked like a standard British rail platform, ordinary in every way. The doors opened with that same pneumatic sigh. "This is your stop," Alice said. "Where am I?" "London, King's Cross. You've arrived." Colin looked at his watch. It read 11:53. The entire journey had taken 8 minutes. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you live the life that remains, the one without the future you just burned. It won't be what you planned, but it will be yours." Alice paused. "One more thing. You'll remember this journey. Most don't. But those who pay the price always remember. And sometimes, late at night, you'll wonder if you made the right choice. If the future you gave up would have been worth keeping." Colin stepped onto the platform. The moment his feet touched solid ground, the train began to move again, sliding away into the dark, with Alice still visible through the window. She raised one hand in farewell, or perhaps warning. Then the train was gone, and Colin was alone on a platform in King's Cross at midnight. His phone buzzed. A message from his boss. "Meeting canceled. Client merger fell through. We'll regroup next week." The future he'd burned, the promotion that had been the foundation of everything, had just evaporated. But instead of despair, Colin felt only curiosity. What would he do now? What paths were still open? What life could he build from the possibilities that remained? He walked out of the station into a London night that felt charged with potential. Every direction he could walk was a choice. Every decision was a doorway. And somewhere, on a train that traveled between moments, Alice was helping another passenger decide what future they were willing to sacrifice for the chance to reach any destination at all. Colin never saw the train again, but sometimes, late at night, when he heard the distant whistle of a locomotive passing through the dark, he wondered about the passengers who were still riding, still frozen between moments, still unwilling to pay the price that would set them free, and he wondered if they envied him his choice, or pitied him for the future he'd burned to make it. Story 4. The voicemail had been waiting for 3 days before Sarah found the courage to listen to it. She'd seen her sister's name on the missed call list and had felt her stomach drop. They hadn't spoken in 8 years, not since the argument that had fractured their family, not since Sarah had said things she couldn't take back. Now Emma was calling, and Sarah was terrified of what that might mean. She pressed play while sitting in her car in the grocery store parking lot, reasoning that if the message was devastating, at least she wouldn't be at home. where she'd have to sit with it. Emma's voice came through the phone speaker, and Sarah's first thought was how sick she sounded. Thin and strained, like something was crushing her chest. "Sarah, it's me. I know you probably don't want to hear from me. I wouldn't blame you if you deleted this without listening. But I need to tell you something. I'm dying. Lung cancer, stage 4. They've given me maybe 2 months." A pause, filled with the sound of labored breathing. "I don't want to die with this between us, with all the things we didn't say. I'm at Mercy Hospital, room 314. If you can find it in yourself to visit, I'd like to see you, just once, before it's too late." The message ended. Sarah sat in her car while shoppers pushed carts past her windows, while the afternoon sun heated the interior to uncomfortable levels, while her mind tried to process the information her sister was dying. 8 years of silence. 8 years of pretending she didn't have a sister. 8 years of walking past photographs and forcing herself not to remember. And now Emma was dying and wanted to see her. Sarah's first instinct was to delete the message and drive away, to pretend she'd never heard it, to protect herself from the complicated grief of reconnecting with someone she'd trained herself to forget. But as she started her car, her hands turned the wheel toward the hospital, instead of toward home. Mercy Hospital was a gray concrete building that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd never experienced joy. Sarah sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, arguing with herself. Emma had been wrong too. Emma had said terrible things as well. Emma had made her own choices, but none of that changed the fact that Emma was dying, and Sarah would have to live with whatever choice she made today for the rest of her life. Room 314 was at the end of a hallway that smelled of antiseptic and despair. Sarah stood outside the door, her hand raised to knock, frozen by indecision. Before she could choose, the door opened. A nurse emerged, saw Sarah's frozen posture, and smiled with practiced sympathy. "Are you here for Emma? She'll be so glad. She's been hoping someone would visit." Sarah entered the room before she could change her mind. Emma lay in the hospital bed, diminished by illness in ways that were shocking. She'd always been larger than life, forceful and confident. Now she looked fragile, breakable. Her eyes opened as Sarah approached. For a moment, neither of them spoke. 8 years of silence hung between them, heavy as gravity. "You came," Emma whispered. "I didn't think you would." "I almost didn't," Sarah admitted. She sat in the chair beside the bed, keeping a careful distance. The voicemail, "You said you wanted to talk before I die." "Yes." Emma's smile was bitter. Funny how impending death makes you want to resolve things. How the things that seemed insurmountably important suddenly feel small. Sarah felt tears prickling her eyes. "I'm sorry for what I said, for the years we lost, for all of it. I'm sorry too. I was cruel. I was judgmental. I made your life harder when it was already hard." Emma reached out a hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Sarah took it. The skin was papery, cool to the touch. "But I didn't ask you here to exchange apologies. No. I asked you here to tell you a secret. Something I've never told anyone. Something I need you to know before I die." Emma's grip tightened. "Promise me you'll listen to the whole story before you judge. Promise me you'll understand that I did what I thought was right." Sarah nodded, though unease was coiling in her stomach. Emma took a rattling breath. "Do you remember when Mom died? You were 16, I was 23. Of course I remember. Do you remember how I handled all the arrangements? How I told you not to worry about the details? That I'd take care of everything? Sarah remembered. She'd been grateful at the time, grateful to be spared the burden of planning their mother's funeral while trying to navigate her grief. "I lied to you," Emma said, "about how she died, about what happened in the hospital." Sarah pulled her hand back. "What are you talking about? She had a stroke. She was in a coma. The doctor said there was no brain activity. That part was true, but what I didn't tell you was that Mom woke up. Just for a few minutes, just long enough to speak." The room seemed to tilt. "She woke up, but you said..." "The doctor said..." "I asked them to lie, to tell you she never regained consciousness. Because what she said when she woke up, Sarah, I didn't think you could handle it. I didn't think it was fair to burden you with it." Sarah stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "What did she say?" Emma closed her eyes. "She said she was glad it was ending, that she'd been waiting for permission to stop fighting. She said she'd been exhausted for years, that being our mother had drained her dry, that she loved us, but love wasn't enough to make her want to stay." The words landed like physical blows. Sarah steadied herself against the wall. "No, Mom wouldn't say that. She loved us. She did love us. That's what made it so terrible. She loved us and still wanted to be free of us." Sarah thought of her mother, the woman who'd raised them alone after their father left, the woman who'd worked 2 jobs to keep them fed, the woman who'd never complained, never showed weakness, never admitted that the weight of single parenthood might be crushing her. "I don't believe you," Sarah said, but the words lacked conviction. "Why would I lie? What would I gain by making this up?" Emma opened her eyes. "I've carried this secret for 24 years. It's poisoned everything. Every memory of Mom got contaminated by knowing that she died relieved to be done with us. And I couldn't tell you, couldn't share the burden. So I carried it alone." Sarah sank back into the chair. Her mind was reeling, trying to reconcile the mother she remembered with the mother Emma was describing. "Is that why you were so angry? Why we fought?" "Partly. I was angry at Mom for dying. Angry at her for admitting what she really felt. Angry at myself for being the kind of daughter who exhausted her. And I took it out on you because I couldn't tell you the real reason I was in pain." The fight 8 years ago suddenly made horrible sense. Sarah had been trying to share a memory of their mother, something sweet and nostalgic. And Emma had exploded, had said their mother had been miserable, had accused Sarah of romanticizing a woman who'd never wanted them. Sarah had thought Emma was being needlessly cruel, had thought her sister was rewriting history to justify her own bitterness. "You should have told me," Sarah said. "I had a right to know. You were 16. You just lost your mother. I thought I was protecting you. You were protecting yourself. You didn't want to face it alone, so you made me the villain. Made me the reason we couldn't talk about Mom. Made me the one who'd idealized her, while you told the hard truths." Emma nodded slowly. "You're right. I was a coward. And by the time I realized my mistake, we'd already stopped speaking. I told myself it was easier this way, that we'd both moved on. But I've regretted it every day." They sat in silence. The hospital room's machines beeped their steady rhythms. Outside, evening was falling, painting the world in shades of gray and amber. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Sarah said finally. "I don't know if I can forgive Mom for what she said, or myself for not seeing how hard things were for her." "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Emma said. "I'm just asking that you know the truth, that you don't spend your life wondering why we broke apart, that you understand it wasn't your fault." Sarah thought about the 8 years they'd lost, the nieces and nephews who didn't know their aunt, the holidays spent alone. The grief that could have been shared but was instead carried in isolation. All of it because Emma had decided to bear the weight of their mother's truth alone. "I'll try," Sarah said. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a beginning. She visited Emma every day for the next 6 weeks. They talked about their mother, about the complicated love of exhausted parents. They talked about their own mistakes, their own cruelties, and slowly, painfully, they began to rebuild something from the ruins of their relationship. Emma died on a Tuesday morning in April. Sarah was holding her hand. The last thing Emma said was, "Don't carry this alone. Whatever weight you inherit from me, from Mom, from anyone, share it. Let someone help," Sarah promised. And in the years that followed, whenever she felt the weight of secret knowledge threatening to crush her, she'd remember Emma's hospital room, the confession that had broken 8 years of silence, the truth that had been too heavy to carry alone. She'd think of her mother, who'd loved her children, but had also been exhausted by them, who'd needed permission to stop fighting. And Sarah would remind herself that people were complicated, that love and exhaustion could coexist, that sometimes the hardest truths were the ones we carried about the people we'd lost. And late at night, when she missed her sister with an intensity that felt like physical pain, she'd whisper into the darkness, "I understand. I forgive you. I forgive Mom. I forgive myself." It wasn't enough to erase the lost years, wasn't enough to undo the damage, but it was enough to help her keep living, enough to help her carry forward without being crushed by the weight of everything that had gone unsaid for too long. And sometimes, that was all you could ask for. Story 5. The antique store on Marrow Street had been there for as long as anyone in town could remember, its windows perpetually dusty, its interior lit by lamps that predated electricity. Gwen had passed it 1,000 times without going in, always meaning to, but never finding the right moment. Until the estate sale advertisement appeared in her mailbox on a Wednesday morning in November. Entire inventory must go. Everything 70% off. Final week of business. She didn't need anything from an antique store. Her apartment was already cluttered with possessions she barely used. But there was something about the phrase, "final week of business," that created urgency. The sense that she was about to lose access to something important, even if she didn't know what that something might be. The store's interior smelled of old paper and older wood, with undertones of something that might have been lavender or might have been decay. The owner, a woman who appeared to be in her 80s, sat behind a counter reading a book, with the kind of focus that suggested she wasn't interested in making sales. Gwen wandered the aisles, running her fingers over furniture that had outlasted its original owners, past shelves of books that smelled of mildew and abandoned stories, past racks of clothing that had been fashionable in decades that now felt like distant countries. And then she found it. A painting, maybe 2 feet square, in a simple black frame. It showed a woman standing at a window, her back to the viewer, looking out at a landscape that was more suggestion than detail. But what caught Gwen's attention wasn't the subject matter. It was the feeling of recognition that gripped her when she looked at it. She knew this painting, or more precisely, she knew the woman in it. The set of her shoulders, the angle of her head, the way her hand rested on the window frame. It was exactly how Gwen stood when she looked out her own apartment window in the early mornings, coffee in hand, watching the city. "Wake up. That one's not for sale," the store owner said without looking up from her book. Gwen jumped, not having realized the woman was paying attention. The sign said everything must go. Everything except that. That's personal. How much for it? Gwen asked, surprising herself with her own insistence. The store owner finally looked up. Her eyes were sharp despite her age, appraising. You feel it, don't you? The connection. I don't know what you mean. The painting recognizes you. Happens sometimes with particular pieces and particular people, like calls to like. The store owner set down her book and stood with visible effort. Come here, I'll tell you about it. They sat in chairs that had probably been expensive once, and the store owner studied Gwen with uncomfortable intensity. My mother painted that in 1952. She was working in a mental institution at the time, teaching art therapy to the patients. One of them, a woman named Catherine, painted that self-portrait over the course of 6 months. When she finished it, she hung herself in her room. Gwen felt cold spread through her chest. Why are you telling me this? Because you need to know what you're buying, if you insist on buying it. The store owner paused. Catherine believed she was painting her future, said she could see forward in time, but only to the moment she'd die, that she was standing at a window in a home she didn't recognize, looking out at a city she'd never visited, waiting for something to arrive. The painting was her way of documenting what she saw. That's a horrible story, Gwen said. It's the truth, and the painting has been in my family ever since, passed down mother to daughter. We keep it because we believe objects can carry intentions. That Catherine put her vision into the paint, and that vision will find its eventual home. Gwen should have walked away, should have left the store and never come back. But the painting called to her with a force that felt like magnetism, like destiny, like standing at the edge of a cliff and feeling the pull of the drop. I'll take it, she said. The store owner wrapped the painting with meticulous care, using brown paper that crackled with age. One more thing, she said as Gwen was leaving. Don't hang it where you can see it first thing in the morning. Don't give it that power. Gwen thanked her and left. The painting clutched against her chest. She knew she should follow the warning, should take it seriously. But when she got home, the first thing she did was hang the painting directly across from her bed, where it would be the first thing she saw every morning. The dreams started that night. Dreams of standing at the window in the painting, watching a city that looked like her own but subtly different, waiting for something, though she could never quite remember what. The dreams felt less like sleeping and more like remembering, like she was experiencing a memory that hadn't happened yet. By the end of the first week, Gwen had developed a routine. She'd wake, see the painting, and feel a jolt of recognition. Then she'd go to her window and stand exactly as the woman in the painting stood, coffee in hand, waiting. She didn't know what she was waiting for, but the painting seemed to know, seemed to be showing her something important. One morning, 3 weeks after buying the painting, Gwen noticed something new, a detail she hadn't seen before. In the lower right corner of the painting, reflected faintly in the window glass, was a date. November 17th, today's date. She looked closer. The reflection wasn't just a date, it was a time. 8:47 a.m. Gwen checked her watch. 8:43. She went to her window and stood in the painting's position, coffee in hand, back straight, head tilted slightly to the right, and she waited. At exactly 8:47, she saw it. A man on the street below, looking up at her window. His face was familiar in a way she couldn't place. Like she'd known him in another life, or would know him in a life that hadn't happened yet. He raised one hand in greeting, or farewell. The gesture was ambiguous, and then he turned and walked away. disappearing into the morning crowd. Gwen felt something break inside her. A tension she hadn't known she'd been holding released all at once. The painting's vision had been fulfilled. Catherine's future had arrived, and Gwen understood with sudden, terrible clarity what the painting had been showing her. Not death, not tragedy, just this moment. This simple recognition between two strangers. This acknowledgement that someone, somewhere, saw her. She took the painting down that afternoon and wrapped it carefully in the brown paper the store owner had used. She wrote a note to attach to it. For whoever needs to see themselves. For whoever needs to know they're seen. And she dropped it at a thrift store, adding it to the endless circulation of objects that move through the world, carrying their intentions, waiting for their eventual homes. The dream stopped. The compulsion to wait at her window faded, and Gwen went on with her life, no longer haunted by Catherine's vision. But sometimes, in crowds, she'd look for the man who'd raised his hand. Wonder what he'd seen when he looked up at her window. Wonder if he'd also felt that strange recognition, that sense of fulfilling a pattern laid down decades before by a woman who'd seen forward in time and painted what she'd found. And late at night, when she couldn't sleep, she'd wonder about the next person who'd find the painting, about what vision it would show them, about what moment they'd be compelled to wait for. Objects carry intentions, the store owner had said, and Catherine's intention had been to be seen, to be recognized, to know that somewhere in the future her vision would find its home. Gwen had been that home, if only for 3 weeks, and somewhere someone else was finding the painting, feeling that same pull, that same recognition, ready to stand at their window and wait for the moment Catherine had painted 70 years ago. The vision that would always find its next viewer, the pattern that would always need fulfilling, the painting that would never quite let go. Story 6. The Lighthouse Keeper's Journal was discovered in June, 3 months after the lighthouse had been automated and the keeper's position eliminated. It was found in a waterproof box buried beneath the kitchen floorboards, which raised immediate questions about why it had been hidden and what it might contain. Detective Marsh, who'd been assigned to what everyone assumed would be a routine investigation, opened the journal in his office on a Tuesday afternoon and immediately realized this would be anything but routine. The first entry was dated January 1st, 15 years earlier. I've accepted the position. 6 months on the island tending the light. 6 months of solitude. It seems almost too perfect. After everything that happened, after all the noise and the people and the expectations, the idea of just me and the sea and the light feels like salvation. The entries for the first few months were exactly what Marsh expected. Details about maintaining the lighthouse equipment, notes on the weather, observations about the seabirds and seals that populated the rocky island, and gradually references to the isolation beginning to feel less like salvation and more like punishment. I thought I wanted to be alone, one entry read. But there's a difference between solitude and loneliness. Solitude is chosen. Loneliness is inflicted. And I'm beginning to understand that I've inflicted this on myself. Marsh skimmed through several months of increasingly melancholy entries until he found what he was looking for. The moment when the journal's tone changed. When the keeper began documenting something other than weather and maintenance. I saw her today, a woman standing on the rocks at the island's eastern point. I called out, but she didn't respond, just stood there, looking out at the sea. I made my way down to meet her, but by the time I reached the rocks, she was gone. No boat, No footprints, nothing to suggest she'd been there at all. But I know what I saw. The woman appeared again 3 days later, according to the journal. Then 5 days after that. Then with increasing frequency until the keeper was seeing her daily, sometimes multiple times a day. She never speaks, never acknowledges my presence. But she's always there, standing at various points around the island, always looking out at the sea, always absolutely still. I've started to think of her as the watcher, to imagine she's waiting for something. Though what anyone would wait for on this godforsaken rock, I can't imagine. Marsh made a note to check if there had been any reports of missing women in the area 15 years ago. The keeper's description was vague, just a woman in a long dress with dark hair, but it was something to follow up on. The journal entries became more obsessed with the watcher, pages and pages detailing her appearances, her locations, her unchanging posture. I tried to photograph her today, set up my camera with a long lens and waited for her to appear. She materialized on schedule, right at the eastern point. I took a dozen shots, but when I developed them, she wasn't there. Just the rocks and the sea, like she never existed. I'm beginning to think I'm losing my mind. Marsh was beginning to think the same thing. The entries were clearly documenting a hallucination brought on by isolation and whatever trauma had driven the keeper to accept such a lonely posting. But then he reached an entry that made him stop cold. I found a journal today, hidden in the same place I've hidden mine. It belonged to the previous keeper, the one who retired 10 years ago. I read it cover to cover. He saw her too. The watcher. He documented her appearances with the same obsessive detail I have. He tried to photograph her. He failed. He began to believe she was waiting for something. And then, in his final entry, he wrote something that's made my blood run cold. Marsh turned the page. The next entry was a direct quote from the previous keeper's journal. I've figured out what she's waiting for. She's waiting for the keepers. For us. She stands on the rocks and watches until we understand. Until we see what she sees. Until we become what she is. I don't know how much longer I can resist. The pull toward the rocks is getting stronger. The sea calls with her voice. And I'm so tired of resisting. The entry concluded with the current keeper's own words. I don't want to believe this. Don't want to think that isolation and the sea and this endless watching has broken me the same way it broke him. But I can't deny what I'm feeling. The pull toward the rocks. The sense that the watcher isn't a hallucination. She's a lighthouse herself. A warning. And I'm too far gone to heed it. Marsh closed the journal and rubbed his eyes. He needed to find the previous keeper. Interview him. Determine if there was any pattern here or just coincidence. But when he searched the records, he found something that made his stomach drop. The previous keeper had died 6 months after retiring. Jumped from a cliff into the sea near his coastal retirement home. Ruled a suicide. Depression following isolation. Marsh opened the journal again and read forward. The entries became shorter, more fragmented. The keeper's handwriting deteriorating from neat script to barely legible scrawl. She spoke today. First time. Said my name. Said she's been waiting. I asked what for. She said, for you to join me. I asked where. She pointed at the sea. The final entry was dated 3 months ago, the day before the lighthouse was automated. I understand now. The lighthouse isn't just a building. It's a trap. A mechanism designed to break people through isolation. To turn them into watchers themselves. The woman I've been seeing isn't a ghost. She's the accumulated grief of everyone who's ever been broken by this place. and she's waiting for me to add my grief to hers. I won't do it. I won't jump. I'll hide this journal and hope someone finds it. Hope someone understands. The lighthouse keeps its keepers, and when it's done with them, it makes them into warnings for the next ones. I've already failed to heed the warning, but maybe whoever finds this won't. Marsh drove to the island the next day, taking a helicopter because the sea was too rough for boats. The lighthouse stood exactly as it had for a century, automated now, its light sweeping across the rocks with mechanical precision. He searched the building and found nothing unusual, no signs of violence, no evidence of anything other than normal occupation. But when he walked to the eastern point, where the journal had described the Watcher's most frequent appearances, he saw something that made his breath catch. A woman in a long dress with dark hair, standing absolutely still, looking out at the sea. She didn't respond when he called out, didn't move when he approached. He got within 10 feet before realizing the truth. She wasn't standing on the rocks. She was carved into them, a natural formation of stone that, from certain angles, looked exactly like a woman standing and watching. It was a trick of erosion and shadow, of desperate minds looking for patterns in chaos, of isolation turning natural phenomena into narrative. Marsh laughed with relief. It was just a rock formation, just the keeper's mind creating meaning from geology, But then the formation moved, just slightly, just enough that Marsh couldn't pretend he hadn't seen it. The stone woman turned her head to look at him, and her eyes were dark and deep and infinitely sad. "You see me," she said. Her voice was wind over water. "You'll write about me, document me, try to explain me away. But you'll come back. They always come back. The lighthouse keeps its keepers, even the ones who only visit once." Marsh ran, scrambled back across the rocks, radioed for immediate extraction, stood at the helicopter pad with his back to the island, refusing to look. The journal was still in his pocket, heavy with implications he wasn't ready to accept. When he returned to the mainland, he filed a report that made no mention of moving rocks or speaking formations, just documented the keeper's apparent mental decline, attributed to isolation. The case was closed. The lighthouse continued its automated operation, and Marsh tried to forget the woman who'd spoken with the voice of wind and water. But he couldn't forget. The image haunted him, and 3 months later, when his vacation came due, he found himself booking a return trip to the island. Not officially, not as a detective, just as someone who needed to verify what he'd seen, needed to prove it had been hallucination or trick of the light. The helicopter pilot thought he was crazy. "Nobody goes to that island anymore. It's automated. There's nothing there." "That's why I'm going," Marsh said. "To see nothing." He spent 3 days on the island camping in the lighthouse keeper's quarters, documenting his experience in a journal of his own. And every day, at the eastern point, the stone woman stood and watched the sea. And every day, Marsh felt the pull toward the rocks growing stronger, felt the sea calling with her voice, felt the understanding creeping in that the lighthouse wasn't just a building. It was something older, something that had been waiting long before the first lamp was lit. On the third night, he buried his journal beneath the kitchen floorboards, in the same place the previous keeper had left his. Added his documentation to the growing archive. "The lighthouse keeps its keepers," he wrote. "Even the ones who think they're just visiting. Even the ones who come to investigate. Even the ones who know better. We see the Watcher, and we can't unsee her. We feel the pull, and we can't resist it. One day, I'll walk to the eastern point. I'll stand beside her. I'll look out at the sea and add my grief to hers. But not today. Today I'll leave. And maybe the next keeper, or the next investigator, will find both journals. We'll read our warnings. We'll stay away. The helicopter arrived at dawn. Marsh boarded it without looking back at the island. The pilot asked if he'd found what he was looking for. "No," Marsh said, "but I found what was looking for me." He never went back to the island, never spoke about what he'd experienced, never filed any additional reports. But sometimes, late at night, he'd drive to the coast and look out at the distant lighthouse, watch its beams sweep across the dark water, and wonder how long he could resist the pull back toward the rocks. How long before he became another entry in another keeper's journal, another warning that wouldn't be heeded. The lighthouse keeps its keepers. The pattern holds. And somewhere on that rocky island, a stone woman stands and watches and waits for the next person to see her. For the next person to add their story to the archive. For the next person to learn what she already knows. That isolation has a gravity. That lighthouses were always traps. And that some warnings are impossible to heed because reading them makes you the very thing they warn against. And so the cycle continues. Another journal will be buried. Another keeper will read it. Another investigation will fail to explain. And the watcher will remain at her post, patient and permanent, collecting the grief of everyone broken by the sea's relentless watching, forever and ever, until the lighthouse crumbles, until the island erodes, until the sea claims everything, and the warning finally has no one left to warn. Well, that brings us to the end of tonight's journey through the dark. If you made it all the way through these stories with me, I want to say thank you. Really, truly, thank you. There's something special about sharing these hours together, about knowing that wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is where you're listening, we've been connected by these tales of the strange and unsettling. I hope you found something in tonight's stories that resonated with you. Maybe something that made you think or wonder or look at the ordinary world just a bit differently. That's what I love most about these stories, the way they remind us that beneath the surface of everyday life, there are deeper currents running, mysteries we can't quite solve, patterns we can't quite see. Before you drift off, if you enjoyed tonight's stories, I'd really appreciate it if you'd take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Stillness broadcast. It helps more people find these stories, helps us build this community of night listeners. And I love knowing you're out there, all of you, sharing this experience. I'll be back tomorrow night with more stories, more mysteries, more journeys into the spaces between the ordinary and the impossible. Until then, sleep well, dream peacefully, and remember, sometimes the stories that unsettle us most are the ones that feel just a little too close to truth. Good night, wherever you are. See you tomorrow in the stillness.